Hey guys, sorry for not many uploads recently, but I've been working on my final project, and that is precisely this, which you are watching now. So I did have ideas of it being something slightly more grand, with all sorts of different authorities from all over the place, and I'd bring in transgender activists to argue their position, and gender-critical feminists to argue against that, and explore all these different topics. However, in the end I decided that less is more. I ended up throwing out a fair bit of my research, but I think I've got a nice streamlined little installment for you, which is basically an interview I had with Bev Jackson, who is a lesbian woman that is active in the LGB Alliance. Obviously, the first thing I wanted to know in speaking to her is, where does this idea of an LGB alliance come from, and what are some of the concerns that LGB people have about transgender activists, who, by the way, she refers to as gender identity extremists, which is probably the term I'm going to be using from now on. I must also briefly apologise that a few syllables are lost every now and then from poor internet connection, but it's all still understandable.
So let's just look at the UK for a moment, because the situation in America is very different. If we only look at the UK, we see that Stonewall was an LGB organisation for many, many years. In 2014, Ruth Hunt took over as CEO, and in 2015, he was added. That is only 5 years ago. All right, so let's not act as if it's always been LGBT. It hasn't. That was added in 2015. Fred Sargent, who's one of our strongest supporters and who lives in the United States, and he was actually coming home and witnessed the beginning of the Stonewall riot that led to the Stonewall uprising. And he constantly has to go online to refute all kinds of really rather absurd stories which are told again and again and again, that it was trans people who started the gay rights movement. You would never have your rights without the trans people. And he, constantly has to explain that there were no trans people involved in the gay rights movement that he was involved in. His partner, Craig Rodwell, actually launched Pride. And although there were certainly some trans people doing important things for their community, they were not involved in the gay rights movement in the way that is constantly presented. And this is just misrepresented again and again. And I was, as I say, at the beginning of the Gay Liberation Front. There were no trans people involved at the beginning of the Gay Liberation Front either. It's very odd and distressing to have our history rewritten and misrepresented all the time, and to have people in history kind of, transed people who referred to themselves at the time as gay men now being referred to as trans when that is not how they saw themselves at all.
Now obviously that's just talking about the history, but LGB Alliance is about having a group for LGBT people today and not having trans activism be a part of that. So naturally I wanted to know, why does the LGB Alliance still need to exist in a world where we now have the LGBT movement?
The T is a separate issue. I mean, you hear on the BBC sometimes people talking about LGBT relationships. What on earth is an LGBT relationship? No idea. LGB is about relationships. It's about sexual orientation. It's about, who you form relationships with, who you're attracted to, and the kind of relationships you have. Either you're attracted to people of the same sex or the opposite sex, or both sexes. That is sexual orientation. T is a completely separate issue. It isn't about relationships. It's about your identity. And when people say we removed the T, we didn't remove the T. We saw that people with same-sex sexual orientation were no longer being supported by these groups. So we said, okay, well, if you're not going to support us, we need our own group, apparently, just like we had before. And we're being accused of being exclusionary. But trans people can have their own groups. They should. It's right for trans people to fight for their own right. Let them do so. But there is a conflict of rights, and you can't even get anywhere unless people accept, okay, so there are certain rights conflicts. What are we going to do about it? We see ourselves as the true people taking on the legacy of the gay rights movement that some of us started 50 years ago. I was one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front, and my business associate and fellow founder of LGB Alliance, Kate Harris, worked with Stonewall for many, many years as a fundraiser. So we have a long history in the gay and lesbian rights movement. And it's so distressing to us and completely amazing. I mean, I was working for refugee rights and in the environmental movement, and I wanted those are the things that I wanted to be doing now. I never imagined that I would have to go back and fight for the same rights now that I fought for 50 years ago. It's completely insane. And it's so distressing that the people who are opposing us and who are refusing to talk to us and who are silencing us are the people who now supposedly represent the LGBTQ plus movement. It's really, really very distressing to have to be doing this, but we feel it's so important that we must do this work. What Stonewall did when it took on board T, which is not about sexual orientation, it's a completely different issue, is they redefined homosexuality. They redefined, they started talking about same gender attraction instead of same sex attraction. Well, what on earth does that mean? I'm not attracted to someone's gender. I'm not interested in someone's gender, since I don't have a gender and I don't, but it's not a level on which I operate. What it means is that within Stonewall now, and within all the major so-called LGBTQ plus organizations, that gradually sex has been driven out, and they now go by gender, which is how someone identifies. This is against homosexuality. This is homophobic. What has happened is that the whole LGBTQ plus movement has become homophobic. And when you say this, it sounds completely mad. How can the organizations that were once set up to fight for the rights of people whose sexual orientation is towards their same sex now be homophobic? It is true. You can find, literally thousands of examples online to prove it. That, oh no, you're a genital fetishist. A genital fetishist? What the? Excuse me. Is a genital fetishist. Males who are attracted to other males, that is what they are. They're gay. It's not about to call that genital fetish is the most profoundly homophobic thing you can do. And so what we find now is that gay people and lesbians are being excluded by the very so-called inclusive bodies that now parade themselves as inclusive. The main homophobia that we are opposing now is from within the LGBTQ plus movement. And that is what's so tragic and so horrific. And that is why we are necessary as LGB. LGB is about sexual orientation. It's about people who are gay, two men who are attracted to each other. And they both have penises, and they're into penises. All the gay men I've ever met are really into penises. It's their right. That is what sexual orientation is. Gay men really like penises, right? It's clear. Gay women, lesbians, are really into other females, other female bodies. And it's not just bodies. It's also the experience of having grown up male or female. Homosexuality is criminalized in many, many countries, and they don't care about how you identify. What's important is that they think it's disgusting that two males have sex together, or two females. That is what homosexuality is. It's about sexual orientation. You cannot have sexual orientation without having sex. You accept that you're male or female, two males having sex together, feeling sexually attracted to each other. That's homosexuality. And lesbianism is females being sexually attracted to each other. There is just no doubt about that. That is what it is.
The idea that the LGBT movement is no longer standing up for LGBT rights and in fact totally rejects the idea of being attracted to somebody's sex is quite concerning. However, when it comes to lesbians in particular, there is a growing concern that gender identity extremists are basically attacking lesbians, presumably for reasons relating to misogyny.
Yeah, so if I talk about lesbian erasure on three levels, firstly, I think it will come to three levels. So let's start with two levels. Firstly, as you say, cotton sealing. So within the LGBTQ plus movement, because they've gone now for same gender instead of same sex, lesbians are expected to accommodate males who consider themselves female and agree that these people can be lesbians. And people who don't accept that are called transphobic. So the cotton ceiling, which is a kind of in the most extreme form, almost a kind of rape culture, because the original cotton sealing classes were taught in Canada. And this was a way of teaching males who considered themselves females how to seduce lesbians. I mean, it's outrageous. Basically, it's trying to break down the boundaries of lesbians. I mean, when I was growing up, and I was a young lesbian in the 1970s, there were lots of men who would joke, I feel like a lesbian. It was a kind of crude joke. And now you have males who say that they are actually women and they are actually lesbians, and getting very angry if people don't accept it. The difference is not that clear to see why this, but because it is not accepted to say, no, those people are not lesbians, they're not women, and because so many institutions in society have bought into this, it's very distressing for young lesbians who go onto a dating site, for instance, and find that that half the people on there are people with male bodies, and most of them presumably very pleasant people, but there will always be some who are aggressive and come onto them aggressively. And you can imagine, if you're 18 or 19 years old and you're looking for you're a young woman looking for your first girlfriend, that it might be very intimidating knowing how to reject people in a way that's tactful, and just making clear that actually, no, you're not interested, or not even finding that out until the first date, because some people are not. I mean, this will always be a minority who behave in this unpleasant way, but it's just very unfortunate that lesbians cannot have a dating site which is only for lesbians. No, you have to accept people with male bodies who define themselves as lesbians, because of this wholesale belief that you should accept someone's identity instead of biological facts. So lesbians have no spaces anymore. There is just one, After Ellen, I think, is the only publication left which is now truly for lesbians. Most other publications have bought into the gender identity theory model, and there's you can't have lesbian spaces at all. So that's one way of in which lesbian erasure is being achieved. And also, as you know, if you go along in Pride and have banners which say lesbians don't have penises, or anything which indicates that you are standing up for true lesbians, then you get ejected from Pride pretty quickly, and you get shouted down by gender and identity extremists and vilified, and you get cursed and so on. And small groups of lesbians do dare to do it, and they're always now shouted down. And when a group joined Pride in Lancaster last year, they were shouted down by some gender identity extremists, and who were on Twitter cheered on by Jan Gooding of Stonewall. Yes, very good reaction, she said. The right instinct to shout them down. So, I mean, this is the way in which the people who've inherited the gay rights movement have now turned on their own, and it's just disgraceful. So that's one mode of lesbian erasure. And the other mode of lesbian erasure that I really want to talk about is this huge rise in the number of girls who've been referred to gender identity clinics, over the 4,400% rise in the last 10 years. As we know from the Newsnight episode that I'm sure that you watched, and from that recent report from psychiatrists, which show the astonishing figure. I think the most astonishing thing I've read this year was that when you look at these girls, that only 8.5% of them say that they are exclusively attracted to the opposite sex. I mean, I just looked at this figure and what? 8.5. So almost none of them. So, and then you look closer at the tables and you see that 70% of them are exclusively lesbian, and just over 20% are bisexual. So it's mainly young lesbians who are turning up at the gender clinics. And as you know from we've talked to clinicians who say, yes, lesbianism is considered the lowest of the low. You don't want to be a lesbian these days. That's a yuck. That's a yucky thing to be. Trans is cool. Being trans is cool. So you see all these people who start off as lesbians, especially butch lesbians, and then you meet them a year or two later and they're turning into boys. They're taking testosterone. I mean, that is literal lesbian erasure. It is. I mean, I think that this is going to be the biggest medical scandal of the century. Well, at least from this part of the century. God knows what awful other things might happen in the future. But I mean, this is literally getting rid of young lesbians and turning them into men. And they're not really men. And you know that we're also now seeing a growing number of young women in their 20s who are regretting having transitioned. They've got deep voices. They've got that they have to shave. In some cases, they've had their breasts removed, and they're coming to a realization that they were actually lesbians, but that they were struggling with their sexual orientation. I mean, this is just it's just profoundly disturbing that this is what's happening. And we need more lesbian role models. We need to raise the status of lesbians so that girls don't feel that that feeling attracted to other girls means that they must be male. I mean, this is just going backwards. How dare anybody suggest that there's something progressive about that? It is just, it really, that's nothing that makes me angrier than that. And if you go, one of the most notorious figures in California is Joanna Olson Kennedy. I don't know if you've ever seen the little video of Joanna Olson Kennedy. You can see a video online of her talking about the fact that it's perfectly okay to give double mastectomies to underage girls, and if they decide they want breasts later on, they can go and get them. I mean, this is just vile. This is just so vile. And so this is the worst kind of lesbian erasure. And then, of course, I suppose the third type is what we were saying before, that if you indoctrinate children, and I call it indoctrination, into the idea that you might be a little boy trapped in a girl's body, then you are encouraging girls who are attracted to other girls, or who are gender non-conforming, like most of us, to think that they might be boys, and that is another way in which, and then they end up at the gender clinics and so on. So we really have to ask ourselves, where have we got to in society where this is happening? And we need a debate. We seriously need a debate on sex and gender, because there is nothing progressive about gender identity theory. It is not progressive. It is the opposite of progressive.
Speaking of gender identity theory, I really wanted to ask some probing questions about theory regarding how gender was defined by Jackson.
We think it's very simple. There are two sexes, and boys and girls should be encouraged to grow up completely without any preconceptions as to the kind of activities and behavior and relationships that they ought to form. End of story. That's not theory. That's really just actually how we would like to see kids grow up, and how we would like to see people to behave in society. And we believe we should all treat each other with respect. But that it's when identity politics is brought into it that it becomes murky. Gender is used in 3 different ways. There are people who use, and this is how it perhaps first came into use, commonly use gender as a synonym for sex. So people talk about, the gender pay gap, and what they mean is the pay gap between men and women. But they use the word gender as a synonym for sex, and so that's one way in which it's not the way I use. Then there's another way that people use the word gender, which is how you feel inside. Do you feel inside like you're male or female? And that is called your gender or your gender identity. Those words are used interchangeably. That is not how I use the word gender, and I reject that. And therefore, I have a third, the way I use gender, and the way all sort of what I would say feminists use gender, is as a tool for trying to force, trying to pressure boys and girls as they grow up to adopt certain stereotypical patterns of behavior, pink and blue, Superman and Barbie, all this kind of stuff. So I view gender in that sense as a totally negative thing, a totally negative force trying to constrain boys and girls into specific patterns of behavior. And therefore, the idea that I have a gender or have a gender identity, I find extremely offensive, because I see gender as a wholly negative thing, and certainly not something that should be encouraged or embraced or anything like that.
I also wanted to know Jackson's view on biological sex.
That's about sex, which is biological sex, and there are two sexes, as you know, male and female. People who are born male grow up to become men, and people who are born female grow up to become women. So that's about sex. Nothing is assigned at birth. I had two daughters, and in the case of my second daughter, I knew that she was a daughter, that she was a girl long before she was born. Sex is not assigned at all. It's observed. You can observe whether a child is male or female, and nothing is assigned. This word assigned, I mean, you can make a whole list of words which are just misused. You assign a name to somebody. Somebody decides that you're going to be called Michael. That is a decision that somebody makes. You're born, and then your parents decide to give you the name Michael. I was given the name Bev. Those things are assigned, but nobody assigned you the sex male. Nobody assigned me the sex female. This is observing. But you're forgetting the intersex people, they say. Well, that is a complete red herring, and it's extremely offensive to intersex people who don't call themselves intersex anyway. They call themselves people with differences of sexual development. Let's be clear, people with DSDs, differences of sexual development, are not neither male nor female, and they are not somewhere in between. They are, in fact, almost without exception, either male or female with certain medical disorders. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the whole trans issue, but they're constantly being brought in to prove some completely nonsensical idea that sex is on a spectrum. Sex is not on a spectrum. Anyone who's ever tried to conceive a child knows very well that if you're female and you want to conceive a child, you're going to need a male person, and you know where to find them. It's just completely ridiculous. There are males and females in the world, and people with differences of sexual development do not, at least most of them, do not want to be brought into this discussion about gender, because it's got nothing to do with them. Without sex, you have you cannot define sexism. Without sex, you cannot define homosexuality or lesbianism. We must keep, and that's why hashtag sex not gender is one of the hashtags that we use most often, because we do insist that biological sex is important, and that it is the basis for sexism, it's the basis for homophobia.
Another distinction I saw particularly important to clarify is the difference between being transgender, which is to say identifying as a gender that doesn't cohere with your biological sex, and the idea of being gender non-conforming, which can refer to absolutely anybody who expresses their gender in a way that doesn't line up with conventional gender norms.
Yeah, I'm gender non-conforming. You probably are as well. Most thinking people are gender non-conforming because we don't want to conform to any kind of stereotype. We don't want to. And it was very interesting. I've got two daughters, and I brought up one daughter in the 1980s and one in the 1990s. And the one I brought up in the 1980s, I was able to send her off to school wearing all kinds of unisex clothes and so on. It was not a problem. But the one I brought up in the 1990s, everything had to be pink, and it was princesses and Barbies all the time. I was able to forbid my daughter that I brought up in the 1980s from playing with Barbies because I thought it was a load of rubbish. Couldn't do that in the 1990s. It was just not acceptable. You couldn't do it anymore. You had to conform. The pressure was extraordinary. And I think that this pressure to conform is one of the reasons why gender non-conforming kids, who are simply kids who want to be themselves, who don't want these constraints, are now thinking that they must have been born in the wrong body, that they need to change sex. And that is one reason, I think, behind what's going on now.
Now, with all this clarified, I wanted to know how Jackson would respond to the theoretical claims made by gender identity extremists. So first off, I asked her if she felt like a woman.
I don't feel like a woman. I am a woman, and I've no idea what anybody means by feeling like a woman. Unfortunately, whenever anybody does try to describe it, it's always described in stereotypical terms of so-called feminine characteristics.
But more generally, I wanted to know how she felt about the idea of gender being defined by identity, as opposed to how she defined it.
Well, I just think it's nonsense. And I think it's dangerous nonsense. We don't accept and that's become very clear recently with the self-identity in terms of racial self-identity. You know, that white people who self-ID as black, it's totally not accepted, and it's people say, but how could you possibly? How do you dare to appropriate the experiences of people who have been disadvantaged in certain ways? You can't claim that appropriation, and yet with people, male people, appropriating the experience of females, that argument is not at this moment made, and that is completely contradictory, because in fact you could say arguably race, which doesn't, you know, many people would say that it's racist to even say that race exists. I mean, and certainly people have a mix of racial backgrounds, and you could certainly argue that there's people may be on a spectrum in racial terms. You know, they may have a black parent and a white parent, and or whatever. Whereas male and female is much more fixed. In fact, people are male or female. What people feel, I mean, people may have a religious feeling. People may feel profoundly serious and sincere about their relationship to God. That is their right. Why? Of course, they should. People should be free to feel a profoundly deep relationship to God, and to go and worship in churches or in mosques or in synagogues, or temples or wherever. But that doesn't mean the rest of us have to do it. And those of us who don't have a profound relationship with God, or don't believe in God altogether, must be free to go about our lives, and we can respect each other. I can respect a person who is very, you know, a devout Muslim or devout Jew or devout Christian without believing in having those beliefs myself. And that is how I feel about gender identity. If you believe that you have a gender identity, you seriously, you have a sincere belief in that, I would not, it's not my place to go against your belief. It's your personal belief, your personal experience. But what I do not accept is teaching children in particular that everyone has a gender identity. No, everyone does not have a gender identity. I don't have one, and I will not have it imposed on me. Children should not have it imposed on them. It is a belief. You should not teach children beliefs as if they were fact. You can teach them about the tenets of a different religion. You know, you could teach them that Christians believe this and that, Muslims believe this and that. It's good that you should teach people the kind of beliefs that people may have. But as long as you teach them that those are beliefs, you can teach there are some people who believe they have a gender identity. Yes, that's fine to teach that, but don't teach it as fact.
Another issue that Jackson brought up was with the very term trans itself that is used by many pro-trans organisations.
If you look at the definition of what trans can mean on Stonewall's website, Stonewall has a glossary of terms, and it includes cross-dressers, people that we used to call transvestites. You can't say that anymore. It includes transsexuals. You're not allowed to say that anymore. Even transsexuals who want to call themselves transsexuals get shouted at and abused by the gender identity extremists. It includes people who are male on Tuesday and female on Thursday. So in other words, you cannot make any statement about trans people because it includes an enormous variety of different kinds of people. Includes non-binary, it includes neutral people who have all their genitals removed because they don't want to have sexed bodies at all. It includes such an extraordinary variety of different kinds of people that you cannot say anything about trans people. It's like making a statement about all people of a particular nationality or something. There's so much diversity among them. There's nothing, I believe, that you could say that a girl aged 14 who is struggling with her body and who believes herself to be a boy has in common with a middle-aged man who's fathered 3 children and who now says that he's a woman. Those people have nothing in common with each other. I don't know how you can call them any label that is, you know, these are 2 individuals with a different set of problems.
Indeed, Jackson was also very quick to acknowledge the wide variety of expressions of trans activism that go beyond what she identifies as gender identity campaigning or gender identity extremism.
And I want to make it absolutely clear that most trans people are utterly sincere, I'm sure, about their experience. Their experience deserves to be heard. Trans people should be respected. We support trans rights. What we do not support is the aggressive behavior of trans rights activists that we don't call trans rights activists anymore. We call them gender identity campaigners, and in some cases gender identity extremists, because we don't believe that they are actually advancing the cause of trans rights at all. So when you ask me about sincerity, I'm sure that many people are very sincere about what they feel. It's true that that people who do accept that a diagnosis of gender dysphoria should be required in order to acquire a gender recognition certificate, that those people are experiencing trouble from the gender identity extremists. Because of this whole idea of self-ID. I mean, self-ID is the thing that we most profoundly disagree with. We just think that self-ID is a really dangerous notion. The original 5,000 in the UK, 5,000 people for whom the Gender Recognition Act was created, were largely males who suffered from gender dysphoria to such a terrible extent. This caused great distress that they needed to take hormones, they needed to undergo surgery in order to live their lives as women, in inverted commas. This was a legal fiction. It was in order to help them lead their lives in a fulfilling and satisfying way with respect in society, without suffering from the consequences so much of their gender dysphoria. But what we see now is not 5,000, but 500,000 people calling themselves trans. That's why we don't talk about TRAs anymore, because we firstly, we do believe in trans rights. We don't oppose trans rights at all, and a lot of our supporters are trans, but we have growing numbers of trans supporters. In fact, I mean, you look at the remarks of Buck Angel, for instance, who gets incredibly angry, and Debbie Hayton and Miranda Yardley and Seven Hex. A lot of these people have actually been thrown off Twitter because of what they've said. We've got a lot of trans supporters, and who are actually outraged. They know their experience and they know what they've been through, and they think that the current identity craze is really harmful. They don't believe in self-ID at all, and they are vilified. They're not the right kind of trans people, apparently. It's only the certain kind of trans people whose voices are allowed to be heard. This silencing of people is the worst possible thing.
Now, at this point, Jackson has said at several points that she does value and support trans rights, and she does stand alongside some trans rights campaigners. So obviously, I wanted to know what she considered to be legitimate trans rights.
Legitimate trans rights are rights of trans people as trans people. So, for instance, people who identify as trans should have proper access to housing without discrimination, should have proper access to employment without discrimination, except for certain very specific, sex-specific jobs, for instance, like a rape centre or certain female care occupations. But so there should not be discriminated against. We are completely against President Trump's ban on trans people in the military. That's outrageous. These are people who want to serve their country. It's outrageous to bar them from serving their country because they're trans. So those are legitimate trans concerns, against prejudice. Also, I mean, if any trans person were ever to experience discrimination or harassment, for instance, in the street or in public transport, I would be the first person to leap to their defense, because I will not have anybody persecuted or harassed because of who they are, the way they present themselves in public, any kind of minority group, whether it's for racism or anti-trans or homophobic or whatever it is. I will not have it, and I will always stand up for those people.
Now, all of this theory is currently something which lots of people might not be familiar with. However, it is currently being taught in a lot of schools.
Obviously, it will vary from one school to another. In the thread that we put online a few days ago, you see lots and lots of examples of the external groups that have been coming into schools and that are coming into schools and that teach gender identity theory in a way that we think is very, very harmful. Some schools do have a more sensible approach, and it will vary on the school's policy. The schools have been told that they must be teaching LGBT inclusive relationships and sex education. And obviously, we are totally supportive of LGB education. Of course, kids should be taught that sometimes two men fall in love or two women fall in love. I'm talking about primary schools, the level that you're talking. Small children should be taught that, and that some kids have two fathers or two mothers, or just one mother or just one father, and that this is all perfectly fine. So that this is really sensible LGB inclusive education, and we're totally in favor of that. But what we're not in favor of is teaching children that even though you're a boy, you were assigned that your sex or gender, which, because they get them mixed up, was assigned at birth. It's been completely refuted that you can have a male brain in a female body. This is just, it's unscientific, and it's a dangerous thing to teach children. And this is what worries us most: the idea of teaching children that you might be trapped in the wrong body, that you might be really a boy trapped in a girl's body. This is harmful. We believe it's particularly harmful to children who would otherwise grow up be lesbians, bisexual, or gay men.
One of the consistent justifications for teaching children about accepting these theories of gender in school is that it will in some way decrease instances of suicide.
I mean, the suicide statistics you can find easily on Transgender Trend are refuted. The murder statistics, and also the fact that most sort of MTF trans people retain their genitals, like 84% or something. You can find that on Fair Play for Women. It's completely outrageous that Mermaids has been accusing J.K. Rowling of encouraging children's suicide. The experts on suicide are the Samaritans, and they have very, very clear guidelines as to how you should refer to suicide and the dangers of actually encouraging suicidal ideation by mentioning it in certain contexts. And what Mermaids does is completely indefensible. I condemn it in the strongest possible terms. It's just, it's very dangerous, and you should never misuse, you bandy about false suicide statistics, which is what they've done.
What Jackson is referring to here is the idea that telling people they are more likely to commit suicide can actually increase suicidal tendencies. Of course, gender identity extremists will constantly talk about how transgender children will commit suicide if they don't have their gender identity acknowledged. And as such, by teaching this to young children, they would essentially be encouraging suicide.
Let's be clear. If gender dysphoria isn't a medical problem, then it doesn't require a medical solution. So it's complete nonsense to say, oh, it's not really a medical problem. It's something, it's just bright and lovely and part of the great, a variety of human life. But you need hormones and surgery. And so that makes no sense. I mean, either it's a medical issue or it's not. And so that's one thing.
A final concern Jackson has is the way that children are being discouraged from questioning the theories of gender they're taught and thinking about them openly and honestly. This compounds the fact that a lot of the ideas of gender being taught by gender identity extremists are very heady and are going to be difficult for children to understand.
And it's one of the women I heard, a very powerful speaker in Leeds, and the way she became gender critical was that she heard a story of a little girl who was just 6 years old, who asked some trainee who'd come into the classroom, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And this was a trans person who was very insulted by this question. And this little girl was made to go and stand in the corner for having asked this rude question when she was literally not knowing whether this, and it was just, you cannot do this to people. You cannot force people to adopt your own view of yourself. It's just a complete misunderstanding that society should have to do that, and it must not be imposed on children.
This leads to Jackson's big issue, which is the idea of trans rights seems to have morphed into something beyond what she and many other people are comfortable accepting.
What is not legitimate is for a trans person to come along and say, yes, I'm not just a trans person, trans women are women. No, trans women are not women, because if they were women, they wouldn't be trans women. It makes no sense. And you can say it a million times, but it makes no sense. Trans women are male people who, for a variety of reasons, wish to live their lives as women. Unfortunately, in terms of the activists, it's about forcing everybody else to accept your identity. But I mean, if you tell me that you are, a particular person, that you're very talented and this and that, or you're so, you're particularly slim or particularly muscular, or I don't know, anything else, any belief you have about yourself, I don't have to believe what you say about yourself. I mean, my thoughts are mine. You don't, this whole question of identity, of identifying yourself, and forcing everybody else to accept the way you identify yourself is profoundly harmful. And what it goes along with is a general trend in society to deny science, deny truth, deny that there's any difference between fact and fiction. And this is it's profoundly authoritarian. If you tell me your pronouns are they and them, I mean, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that information. I mean, you don't have pronouns. Your language does, your name is Michael. That is your name. And if I don't call you Michael, that would be very rude. If I decide to call you Rebecca, that would be really peculiar. But I mean, but but your pronoun, you don't have pronouns. People can't force other people to refer to you in a particular way. That's a kind of tyranny. It's a linguistic tyranny.
Now, the term tyranny might sound a bit extreme, but it does take some subtle forms, and Jackson was keen to talk about the innumerable ways that language is used to manipulate and constrain the conversation.
This word transphobia is, by the way, I mean, that word is abused more than any other word, because what does it mean? It's a phobia. It is supposed to be a morbid fear or dislike, and it's the way it's used within the LGBTQ movement is simply I don't accept what you believe. So many of the words that are associated with this problem are used in different ways as weapons. Exclusionary. Well, yeah, I mean, women's sport is exclusionary. It's for women. So I don't think exclusionary is a very sensible way of talking about it. There's a reason why men and women have different sports categories. If you look at the at the records for male and women in most sports, in athletics and in most sports, you will see that that males in general are 10% stronger, faster, and so on, have all sorts of advantages, and that's why we have women's sport. So I don't think it's correct to say this word. Whenever we use these words, we should think, what does it mean? Exclusionary sounds horrible. You can't come in. I bar you. No, exclusionary is not the right word to use. It's about creating categories that are safe. The word inclusiveness sounds cuddly. It sounds lovely. Let's have a rainbow. Let's be inclusive. What does it mean, inclusive? It means it's called inclusiveness. It's not inclusive because it cuts out us. We're excluded, for instance. We're excluded. Women who believe that it's important to hold on to women's sex-based rights are excluded. So it's not inclusive. Lesbians who know that what it means to be a lesbian it's about women who are attracted to each other. That is what lesbianism is. They are excluded. So this word inclusive is deceptive. A lot of the words that are used by gender identity extremists are very, very deceptive, deliberately deceptive, because inclusiveness sounds nice. And the people who are not inclusive are horrible. They're bigots. What is a bigot? A bigot is someone who does not accept that someone has a different opinion. If you look online, it's very clear who the bigots are, and it's not us, because we're constantly trying to reach out, trying to engage with other people, trying to set up discussions. The people who are bigots are the people who refuse to talk to us. We don't question anyone's right to exist. I mean, this is just completely absurd. But this comes back to identity politics, doesn't it? I mean, if you say you're a woman, and I say, well, sorry, Michael, I just, I don't accept that you're a woman. I mean, you're Michael and I like you and I won't exclude you from employment or housing or anything, but I just cannot believe that you're a woman because that's not how I see you. So I'm not questioning your right to exist if I say that you're not a woman, that I don't accept that you're a woman. That's not questioning your right to exist. It's disagreeing with with your distortion of factual reality. Just as if you say that if you say you're 5 feet tall and you're clearly 6 feet tall, I'm just not going to go along with that because I know what it means to be 5 feet tall and 6 feet tall, and I'm not going to have my reality questioned. I'm not going to have objective reality, factual reality questioned in order to suit your identity. But we're not questioning anyone's right to exist, and I think that is part of the hyperbole, and it's like literal violence. This misgendering. That's another funny word. If somebody refers to me by the pronoun he, I mean, obviously it's completely unimportant, and who cares? if somebody calls you she, I presume that you're not going to get terribly upset about it. Misgendering is an invention, and to call if somebody says they want to be called they and you get it wrong, or you get it wrong either on purpose or by mistake, that you're misgendering them. And then this is called literal violence, and this is questioning someone's right to exist. I mean, all this hyperbole, when it's simply a question that we prioritize science, facts, reality over self-ID and over identity issues. We will not allow ourselves to be co-opted into the subjective views of people who have a particular belief. We do not subscribe to that belief. It's just like a religion. We're not going to call you Mother Superior, if we're not Catholics, and we don't want to adopt somebody else's belief system or the labels that somebody else uses. That's not denying anyone's right to exist. And you describing it in those terms, it's just hyperbole. It's got nothing to do with what it's just another way of shutting down debate to place it in such inflationary terms. But because gender is used in these three different ways, one as a synonym for sex, one as a kind of inner feeling you have, which, as I say, I totally reject, and third, as a tool of oppression, which is basically a way that the patriarchal society pressures kids to adopt certain stereotypical patterns of behavior. Because it's used in these three different ways, it's an incredibly difficult and confusing discussion, because you get people using the word gender in different ways and not realizing that they're using it in different ways. And that's one reason why the whole debate on sex and gender, I think, is so difficult to conduct, because people do not define the words that they're using. Yeah, the worst thing is transphobia, because and some people say we should get rid of all the phobias because they're all. But I mean, I think homophobia, it's fair enough. I think everybody understands what homophobia is. It's a hatred or dislike of and in some cases fear of gay people and lesbians. And I wouldn't necessarily want to ditch it altogether. But the word transphobia has literally been placed in the path. I call it the dragon, the Californian dragon, because it's very much comes from California, from all the media companies that are based in California. You can look at all of them. They're all based in California. All the media companies that control our online debate are based in California. So there's, in a way, it's the Californian culture that is now determining the rules of our online debate. So transphobia is the worst of all. That the accusation of transphobia is a way of just silencing debate. So that's one. The different uses of the word gender is extremely important. The stupid use of the word assigned at birth, the mangled use of inclusive and exclusionary, which don't really mean that at all. There are a host of words which are used in this way, which are simply tricks of placing people in, and the word bigot, for instance, I mean, which is just, it's been turned on its head. So many of the terms have been just turned upside down, literally. A bigot is someone who doesn't accept someone else's point of view. And we're called bigots, which it makes no sense at all, because it's precisely us who are calling for discussions and debates, and whereas the other side refuses to talk to us. And what I think is most offensive, perhaps, is the term non-binary, because it seems to imply that person doesn't feel male or female, like unlike the rest of us who are stuck in some sort of binary mold. I mean, it's trying to claim a kind of specialness, which is very offensive, because I mean, all thinking people are non-binary. I bet you're non-binary as well, aren't you? I mean, we're non-binary in the sense that we do not accept that the fact that we're male or female should constrain the way we behave, or the kind of relationships we have, or the kind of professions we might want to adopt, or the kind of, whether the activities that we want to embrace. We just don't accept any of those constraints. So we're all non-binary, but we don't want to use that label because it's not a special thing. It's just, it's it's refusing to conform to stereotypes.
Something that Jackson stressed, which I've not really heard anybody else stress before, is that it does seem like a lot of the pro-gender identity extremism content is being produced online by these media companies, and that this is actually being pushed onto a country like the UK, where there wasn't really this history of automatically accepting the claims of gender identity theory and inclusion of transgender people in LGBT and women's rights activism.
The experiences in the United States are different from the experiences in the UK in many different ways. In the United States, for instance, at the moment, there's a huge polarization, and it is impossible. It's almost impossible to break down that polarization. In the UK, there is a slightly less polarized. It's also quite fairly polarized, but slightly less polarized atmosphere. And another great difference is that in the United States, religion plays a very important role. Whereas the UK is a largely secular society, so we don't have those influences so much. I mean, we're Guardian, one story after another, and because of the Guardian's financial construction, there seems to be a lot of influence within the Guardian from the American branch of the Guardian, and which is far, and the Americans do not have the sort of strength of gender critical opinion that we've got in the UK. And therefore, anything which supports women's rights in America at the moment is considered transphobic. You're just not allowed to speak out in favor of women's sex-based rights at all. And therefore, where the Guardian has become a bastion of misogyny, to be quite honest. I mean, people like me, if you had asked me, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, to define myself in political terms, I think I would have defined myself as a Guardian reader. That struck me as, that was kind of my identity politically. It was my home. Well, now I've got a subscription to the Times. Welcome to the party. What? How did that happen? I mean, I would never have thought that could happen. It was just, and that is because standing up for women's rights in the Guardian, although, Suzanne Moore and Janice Turner, the fantastic, Janice Turner, of course, in the Times, Suzanne Moore does write for the Guardian, and she bravely puts forward one article after another in support of women's rights and gets an incredible torrent of abuse from the likes of Owen Jones.
Speaking of external influences, I also wanted to find out what her opinion was on this claim that LGB Alliance is in fact a front for conservatives. One of the most common attacks against the gender critical position is that it's in fact a conservative position.
Well, one of the things I find most distressing about this whole argument is the fact that when we try to present our arguments that we oppose the idea of gender identity, the accusation that is hurled at us most often is that we're funded by right-wing Christian fundamentalists or something, that it's right-wing, that this is presented as an anti-progressive argument. We think we're the real progressives because we reject this whole idea that children should be labelled and put into categories. We want every child, every girl and every boy to be totally free to express themselves as they want. And if a boy wants to wear dresses, that's lovely, isn't it? Then you've got, a boy wearing a dress. Why shouldn't he be free to do that? Why shouldn't he be free to call himself whatever he wants to call himself and to wear a dress? That doesn't change the fact that he's a boy. It expands the range of possibilities for boys, and we should accept that. But so we think that we are the real progressives, and that what's so really devastating to us is the huge swathe of opinion on the left, which tries to shut us up and tries to suggest that we're right-wing in some way. Most of the people, if you look down the list of gender-critical groups and people, I mean, you'll find that 90% of them are very much left-wing feminists, basically. Well, at the moment, I mean, in the UK, we have to deal with we have a Conservative government, and we find more people in the Conservative Party who are willing to talk to us than we find in the other parties. We are constantly trying to reach out to people in all parties. We are a non-politically aligned organisation. We are not. We do not define ourselves in political terms. And we are constantly talking to people in the Conservative Party who are very willing to listen to our ideas. But we are also trying on a regular basis to reach out and establish contacts with people in the Labour Party. And it's profoundly hurtful to us that that many people who support our ideas are present or former members of the Labour Party, and the outrageous suggestion that LGB Alliance is an anti-trans hate group, and that Women's Place UK is an anti-trans hate group. These are hurtful, defamatory, and completely false suggestions, which have been adopted at a very high level by the Labour Party and have not yet been refuted or apologised for. And even the TUC adopted a proposal describing us in defamatory terms. There is a suggestion which is profoundly false, and we just need to be able to get our message out. We are not reactionaries, we're not religious, we are not politically aligned, and we will talk to those people who, like us, want to find harmony in society, want to sit down and talk to people about the differences.
When it comes to discussing free speech, Jackson has some additional criticisms for the left of the political spectrum more specifically.
That has not been helped at all by left-wing politicians refusing to confront the issue. Keir Starmer needs to really get to grips with this in his own party. He needs to get to grips with the fact that there are people in the Labour Party. I mean, you know, yesterday, a woman who had written a rousing song in supporting women's rights has been treated in the most abominable way by fellow Labour Party members. This is a woman who's fought all her. I mean, this really brought me to tears. A woman who's fought for Labour causes all her life, has been a unionist and a proud left-wing Labour supporter all her life, is being attacked by fellow Labour members for singing a song in favour of women's rights. I mean, it's just ridiculous, and something has to change in the mindset of people on the left in particular. One thing that we find profoundly important is this silencing of people. The number of people who've lost their jobs or who don't speak out because they're afraid to lose their jobs. This is extraordinary. We are contacted all the time by doctors, by nurses, by therapists, by politicians, by people in every walk of life who agree with us, but who do not dare speak out because they know they will lose their jobs, they will lose their positions, and in some cases lose their family life. And some people have sacrificed an enormous amount to speak out on this issue, because at the moment the climate of opinion is such that only someone with the financial resilience and the great courage of J.K. Rowling, who is willing to stand up and say, you know, speak out in terms of completely compassionate understanding for trans people, but also pointing out that the experience of women is important and that women's sex-based rights must be respected. Yeah, I mean, this is you can so easily get cancelled at the moment, can't you? And I mean, this has serious consequences for people who have had thriving businesses and who say something which annoys the activists, and who suddenly find that their business gets closed down, or that their advertising is no longer accepted, or you know, people, their whole livelihoods are threatened by the fact that they have said something which has annoyed the gender identity extremists. And this is just, it's completely outrageous. And that's why, you know, so you see, for instance, Stephen King, who is a very, very wealthy man, right? He once said something, he liked something that J.K. Rowling had said. And then, so the gender identity extremists come down on him like a ton of bricks. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know if Stephen's publisher phoned him and said, Stephen, you know, you don't want to go there. We're going to lose some income if you do that, so you better retract that. Or whether he just thought, oh, God, no, I can't be doing with this. I'd like to have a quiet life. I was just enjoying, you know, some sunbathing, and I don't want all these people that. But anyway, whatever happened, he retracted. And this happens all the time. That people who do speak out and then think, oh my God, look what's happened. You know, the wave of violence and abuse that comes over them. They just don't want it. They realize that if they speak out, that will suddenly be the center of their life. And they think, no, God, I've got other things to do. I don't want to take this on. I want to spend my time doing all these other things. And they retract because they do not have the courage or the tenacity or whatever it is to persist, because they realize that in the current climate, if you speak out on this issue, then you are suddenly right up there and you attract a huge amount of media attention that you may not want. I mean, we've had, some celebrities who've come over to our side and who've spoken out, and then they've had such trouble in their personal lives from people in their own families who have been angry about it, that they have had to back down and back away, because otherwise their personal lives were under threat. So people's personal lives are under threat. So many of us have lost friendships. I mean, I've lost a friendship, one of my closest friends for 50 years. We're no longer speaking to each other. I mean, this is really painful. So people are risking enormous personal distress, commercial success, their livelihoods are under threat. You have to be very, very brave at this moment to speak out. And that is really shocking. But we need more courage, because the more people who do gather courage and speak out, the easier it will become.
Now, this is all talking about the social incentive against speaking out, but there is also a legal incentive, in that actually believing trans women aren't women can at this point get you in trouble with the police.
And you must distinguish between hate crimes and non-crime hate incidents, which is this completely ridiculous category that has been invented. And you should remember, you only need one person to say that they found something offensive for it to be recorded as a non-crime hate incident. One person. So anybody who is just out to cause trouble and out to get people into trouble can say, I found this or that thing objectionable, I feel offended, I feel attacked. And then that person finds that this, and it goes onto their record, and there's just no way, there's no appeal against it. It's a completely mad thing.
This kind of aggressive silencing is particularly insidious in that it's directed against predominantly women. Thousands of women are being silenced on a society-wide level, and this does have implications for women's rights.
And one thing that is really disturbing, and I never thought that this would happen, but it seems to me that the movement that I call the gender identity extremism movement, and that some people refer to as the trans rights activism, has given a lot of men an excuse to parade their misogyny and to pretend that there's something progressive about it. And that is very shocking. It's very shocking to see the amount of misogyny that has come out of the woodwork since this issue moved center stage. And, it's now, you can, if you are a man and you are a misogynist, you can now parade that misogyny. You can call people fucking bitches and cunts all over the internet. And it's all right now because you can just say they're transphobic and therefore you're progressive. Whereas in fact, it's simply the same old misogyny that we've always known. And there is nothing remotely progressive about it. It's simply hatred of women.
Now, in contrast to this silencing, people like Jackson want something different.
Let's sit down and discuss it. Where are the conflicts of rights? And in some cases, like with sport, I think trans women are going to have to accept trans women do not belong in women's sport. It's just completely nonsense. It's unfair. It's unsafe. And there is just, I don't think there's any room, personally, I don't think there's any room for debate or compromise there. But there are other areas in which there are ways in which we can find solutions, like the bathroom debate, third spaces, that you can find solutions that are safe and for everyone. There will be areas in which it's possible to compromise. But in order to find those compromises, you have to sit down and be prepared to talk to each other. And we're always prepared to talk to people. And it's the other side that won't talk. And in fact, Ollie, what's his name? The guy that made the movie about trans kids, It's Time to Talk. Ollie Lambert, when he made that movie, he tried to get to people, he wanted to talk to people on all sides of the debate. And he found it completely impossible to get anybody on the side of who supported child transition to talk to him. He said that he had previously worked in Gaza and had to talk to Palestinians and Israelis about the problems involving the Gaza conflict, and that he had found that easier than talking to people on different sides of this debate. I mean, that is extraordinary, isn't it? I find that completely extraordinary, that in this debate, getting people to sit down and talk to each other has become almost impossible. And, whenever, if we're asked for an interview, we're not asked for an interview very often, but when we are asked for an interview, they try to get somebody on the other side. They won't talk to us. They don't want to talk to us.
I had that issue. I've been trying to get someone from the other side. It's not easy.
No, they don't want to talk, because as soon as you start talking, you start questioning their attitudes, and they don't like that. I mean, because their attitudes are, if you drill down, are nonsensical. I mean, you find someone saying on the radio that it's old-fashioned to be attracted only to men or women. What? Excuse me? That's like, most people in the world are only attracted to men or women, and it's not old-fashioned. It's just the way sexual orientation works, and you can't influence the way your sexual orientation, and calling it old-fashioned or sexual fetish or anything like that is just a load of bollocks, and you know it. So they don't want to go on the radio and say that, because that makes them look a bit foolish. But if that's what they believe, it's very easy to unmask it, and so they don't want to get involved in a discussion. But you've got to have discussion, because we need to be able to live with each other. People believe different things. You need to be able to get along in society. And when we were fighting for gay rights, we always tried to engage with people, including people, who were homophobic, to try and find out what is your problem, and how can we deal with each other on a basis of mutual respect, and how can we create a society of mutual respect and harmony. Whereas the gender identity extremists are doing completely the opposite. They're just alienating people. In fact, they're creating a very hostile environment, not only for trans people, but ultimately this is going to, it is already leading to a decrease in support for LGB people, because we're associated with all these nutters. I mean, this is just, it's really awful. That there will be a backlash. There will be a backlash, because people think, it's LGBT, it's all one thing. But LGB is about relationships. It's about how you relate, the kind of relationships of the people. T is about how you relate to yourself, how you see yourself. They are separate issues, and that's why they should never have been joined together. It causes confusion in the public mind.
This final point is quite harrowing, the idea that gender identity extremism could lead to a backlash against the entire progressive cause. There does appear to be a silent majority of people who find the concept of identity alone determining gender as at best silly and at worst offensive. It's very easy to imagine why such people would be turned off the entire progressive movement in this case. Nevertheless, when it comes to the future, Jackson is actually a lot more positive.
Well, obviously, I wouldn't be in this struggle if I didn't believe that the tide is clearly turning. It's very obvious that the tide is turning, but the speed with which it's turning, that is not so clear. And whether it's going to go in waves and ups and downs, I don't know. But the main reason why this is all happening is that 95% of the population is not aware of it. So once we are absolutely confident that we represent the majority. We know we represent the majority, of course we do. The majority of people know that men can't change into women. The majority of people know that male bodies have no place in women's sport, but people are not paying attention. And they're not paying attention because of COVID, and because of Brexit, and because of the economy, and a million other things, the environment, that are really distressing people at the moment, and those are foremost in people's minds. So what's going on the sex and gender front is not at the forefront of most people's minds. So in as much as they hear about it, they think, oh, those LGBT people, they seem to be having a row among themselves, not interested. Parents are not aware that their kids are being taught gender identity, and that some boys might be born in girls' bodies. And so our biggest task is just getting information out there. And that's why, if you are able to get this report into a major publication, that will be doing a profound service. It's not easy, because most publications at this moment don't want to run these stories. So that is we're fighting against ignorance. Once the public understands that this is happening, then yes, the tide will turn. It's already turning to some extent. I mean, you look at the difference between 2 years ago, when really anyone who said what we were saying was just completely shut down, and it was unacceptable at all. Now you do get the occasional interview in which these the activism, the gender extremism is being questioned.
Sorry, would you say, because you would have to think surely J.K. Rowling must be a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. She's been absolutely key. She's an absolute star, and we thank her from the bottom of our hearts for standing up and saying in such profoundly eloquent terms and such compassionate terms the things that we've been saying since the beginning. And it's just extraordinary that at Waverley Station in Edinburgh, a sign was put up saying, "I love J.K. Rowling." She lives there, and it's she's the most wonderful writer, a writer who's transformed so many children's lives with her books. "I love J.K. Rowling." And this sign was taken down because it was supposedly political. Now, if you drill down into what happened there, somebody put in a Freedom of Information request. No complaints were submitted about that poster, but I think it was 158 objections were submitted for the fact that they took it down. So you think, well, why did they take it down then? Apparently the decision was made by Network Rail, and why they made that decision, it seems to have been somebody internally on the basis of certain, presumably gender identity extremist views. But this is the sort of thing that happens, and this is just profoundly disturbing, and that they don't seem to realize that actually the action of taking that down is in itself, of course, a political statement. I mean, just like if the police, if Sussex Police or Brighton Police has outside a pink and blue flag, that is pledging the the allegiance of the police to trans activist cause, which is opposed to the interests of the women in the community and the lesbians and other women in the community who are fighting for sex-based rights. That is adopting a political position. It is not acceptable for police forces around the country to be adopting this blatantly political stand.
So that was a bit of an abrupt end because she was actually quite busy. However, there you have it. The belief of Jackson is that most people who would listen to her arguments she's making will find themselves agreeing with a lot of it and considering it quite reasonable. Obviously, you've now heard pretty much everything, so you can make up your own mind. Anyway, that's my video. I technically have a word limit on this, so I'm just going to say please do like, share and subscribe. Sharing is particularly important here because Bev Jackson was very clear on the fact that getting this message out there is the most important thing. I will have new videos coming out soon since I'm done with this final project. Until then, peace to you all and keep questioning nonsense.